Hey, campfire crew, let's get it on. Hey, gang. I put together another episode of cool stories that I've gotten over the years, so I'm dipping into the archives for more awesome listener-submitted stories. I love those the best. Keep them coming. If you've got a true scary story of any nature that you'd like to hear on my podcast or this channel, email it to unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. And of course, also check out my storefront at tpublic.com. A link to that is in the description below. Now, leave us not be hasty. Enjoy these stories submitted by you, the listeners. I rented on Craigslist. Submitted by Carmen. So, I had graduated from college and moved home for a year, and decided I couldn't live with my parents and two younger brothers anymore. Living on your own at school will do that. For the record, I'm a female, and I was 22 at the time this happened around 2002. At first, I thought I was going to split things with a friend, but she decided to stay home and save money as she was planning on moving to Atlanta. We lived in New Jersey. I checked out all these high-end places that required crazy deposits, and a lot of others in the local papers and websites, but they didn't meet my criteria. I wanted to bring my cat. It was frustrating. Every time I did find a cool place, it was either taken or wouldn't be available for like 6 months. I'm sure there's a reason, but I never understood why the hell anyone would advertise for something that wouldn't be ready for 6 months. As a last resort, I checked out Craigslist. I found a couple in a town over from my own, and they were also closer to the restaurant I worked at. The first one was a bust. It was a total dump. But the one that had pictures on Craigslist lived up to what was claimed. It was a 2-bedroom lower with off-street parking, 2 spaces allotted to me with a little yard out back, and cats were welcome. It was a bit over my price range, but otherwise I thought it was great. I was excited to have a second room I could dedicate to my painting and writing. I still do both as a freelancer. I wouldn't have to worry about getting my materials all over my room or the living or dining area. And with that second room, if I got into trouble, I could always get a roommate later. I was so excited to check it out in person with my dad. We got in touch with the owner, and it was available, so we made arrangements to go look at it that night. We got there, and it was a very well-kept place on a nice street with what looked like a lot of family dwellings and huge older homes that had been converted into doubles and such. My soon-to-be landlord was named Ryan, and he lived on the upper residence. He was in his 30s and was very pleasant. He showed us the place, and it was awesome. Newly renovated with new appliances and fixtures, new hardwood floors. Like I said, it was awesome. I lived in other places since this, and a lot of renovated places are just joints with new carpet and paint. And I'm sure a lot of people know what I'm talking about. That new paint is usually caked over dozens of other layers of paint, windows that barely open or close, that sort of thing. My dad was trying to keep me calm, but he knew I wanted it, and I certainly did. Ryan told us to take our time and think about it. I was the only one who had been out to see it so far. Later, I would find out this was a lie. We went back to the car and I told my dad that this was the place. He was already iffy on me being on my own, but he also knew that I was responsible. I reminded him a lot of the places around here didn't have a landlord on the premises. In this area, a lot of the owners live out of state. And it wasn't far from home, and I could even walk to work. So he called my mom, and she said I was too old to be being told what to do, and he agreed. 2 weeks later, I moved in. About a week after I moved in, I had some friends over for a small party, and we were in and out of the apartment and out on the back deck. We were having a blast until my friend Jeff looked up at the awning over the deck and asked what the camera was for. I hadn't noticed it before. It was one of those bubble-looking security camera type things up in the corner. Just then Ryan came up the back steps to see how I was getting along, and I'm sure to score a couple of free beers. I asked him about it, and he said that there were actually 2 cameras. One was in the front and one was in the back. It was just a security measure that he had put in. I thought that made sense, and He hung out for a while and talked to my friends and was really cool. Weeks went by and I was loving life in my place. My job was going well, my painting was going well, and I was lining up interviews as I was trying to get a job in social work at some of the local schools. I had met a guy through my best friend Lisa, and we hit it off and began spending a lot of time together. His name was Patrick, and my parents liked him right away too. He was the first non-Latino guy I had ever dated, so that was quite a feat. One night I came home from the restaurant and met Patrick and his friend David, who was my best friend Lisa's boyfriend. They were hanging outside my place, and I asked what was up, and they said we should go inside. Lisa immediately poured us some wine, and the guys grabbed beers, and we all sat down in the living room. David looked at me and said, I have something to tell you, and it's really embarrassing, and that's why I asked Lisa and Pat to be here too. He unfolded some pieces of paper he had in his pocket, and there were pictures on them. Pictures of me. Lots of them. Me in the bathroom, me in bed with Patrick, me painting naked in my art room. Don't judge me. My jaw dropped open, and I asked where the hell he got those. He was ashamed, but he came across them on a porno website. Lisa shook her head, and he gave her the, "God, I'm really sorry" look. But I didn't give a shit about that. My naked body was on the internet for anyone to see. I first looked at Patrick, but there was no way it could have been him. I was shaking, and Lisa was holding one hand, and Patrick put his arm around me on the other side. I remember crying, and Patrick saying David had called him right away when he saw them, and they both went to the site looking for any clues as to how they got them. But the guy who ran it never replied to them, and there were no names or anything, just pictures of all kinds of women in their homes or wherever. After I stopped crying, I drank some wine, and my Latino blood kicked in, and I got pissed. I was raving at this point, screaming about who was doing this, and then Patrick said, "Wait, notice how none of these are coming from a door or a window?" But Lisa said, "Wait a minute. Jeff." I looked at her and said, "No way, it was Jeff." And she said, No. Remember when Jeff noticed the camera outside?" I nodded. "What if there's more?" My face turned white, and Patrick jumped up and ran to my bedroom with the sheet with the pictures of he and I in bed. We followed him, and he began trying to figure out the angle of the shot, and looked up at the smoke detector in the hallway. There was a little hole in the side of it. He reached up and pulled the unit down, and there were wires that went up into the ceiling. He put it back, and then checked the other one in my art room. Same thing. He ran to the one in my living room dining room area. Another one. Someone had set the entire place up to take pictures of whoever was in the house. I started crying again and yelling and just going berserk. And then it dawned on everyone. Ryan the landlord. He was the only one who could have done this. And just then there was a knock at the door. I grabbed the photos and put them in a pocket, and Lisa opened the door up, and in trooped 3 of our friends, Jeff, Scott, and Ryan. Another one, not the landlord. They were laughing and had brought beer and snacks, but stopped when they saw us looking the way we did. Scott asked what was up, and I looked down, and then back up at Patrick and David. I nodded, and they told him what was up. Jeff said we should put tape or something over them right away, and Patrick did that as we all stood talking. What the fuck was I going to do? Ryan suggested we all calm down and have a beer, and we could brainstorm what we should do next. He then mentioned he thought it was odd that I got the apartment as fast as I did. I asked why, and he said that not only him, but like 3 other guys he knew inquired about the place, and none were offered a lease. I was getting madder and madder when there was another knock at the door. It was Ryan, the landlord. "Oh, I didn't know you had people over. I'll come back tomorrow," he said. I just stared at him, and Lisa asked what he wanted. He smiled charmingly. "Routine maintenance stuff. I need to check the fire extinguisher in the kitchen and test the smoke detectors. Just legal things. No big deal. I'll stop by tomorrow." And then he left. I looked at everyone, and Patrick said, "Call the cops right now." We did, and about a half hour later, 2 showed up, and we told them what we thought was going on, and as embarrassing as it was, I showed them the pictures. Then they took a look at one of the smoke detectors and said that it was likely they had cameras in them. They said they would get a warrant to search the whole building, but it would take a little bit. I asked Patrick to take me to my parents, and he did. Through raging tears, I had to tell my parents what was going on, and my dad went crazy. My mom had to calm him down. He was talking about beating the shit out of Ryan, and what he kept saying was neighborhood justice. Early the next morning, the police met us back at my place, and we let them in. Sure enough, all of the detectors did have cameras that were wired upstairs to Ryan's upper. He wasn't home, so the cops forced entry and found a room that had been hastily cleaned out. There were shelves and racks of cords, and you could tell there were computers or something that once sat on them. That scumbag must have seen the cops show up last night, and then cleared everything out. I grabbed some things and went home, as the police said I should, and they would get in touch with us as soon as they knew more. They caught up with Ryan the next day as he was trying to get back into his place after cutting through backyards. He left his Jeep parked on another street. He was arrested, and they found all kinds of equipment in the back of his car that he'd used to spy on me and the neighbors. It turns out he had some kind of a deal with a local porn shop and was getting paid to get pictures of young Latina women. This guy would then sell them to people on the internet. The thing that made me even sicker is when the district attorney was talking to me and my parents about things, she said it was likely that my pictures were elsewhere on the internet, and there wasn't a lot that we were going to be able to do about it. We were all so sick, but none more than me. Anyway, Ryan did get a jail sentence, but it was only for 4 years, and he got out before serving the whole time. We filed a civil suit against him, and we did get some money, but by then he and his lawyer had messed around with the court system so much it was almost not worth it. Patrick and I split up, and I actually started dating the other Ryan, and we've been married since 2010. A long story, I know, but word to the wise. Be careful who you do anything with that you find on Craigslist. I'm sure more people than not never have any issues, but there's always a scumbag out there waiting to take advantage of you. Oh, and David? He married Lisa, but she to this day hasn't let him live down his cruising the net for porn. And I still thank him every time I see him, because who knows how long that could have gone on if he hadn't seen those pictures. Babysitter Trouble, submitted by Powerplant 56. This happened to me and my brother when I was about 8 and he was 6. I'm calling myself Brian and my brother Jake. It wasn't for another few years that we were allowed to stay home alone, so, like everyone else in the world, we had babysitters. For 1 year, we had this guy that lived up the street who would watch us, and he was awesome. His name was Jim, and he would let us stay up late and would crank rock records with us and tell us dirty stories and jokes right before we went to sleep. I think he was the first guy to tell us the Cheech and Chong Dave's Not Here Man skit, and Jake and I would laugh and always ask him to tell it more than once. Honestly, that still makes me laugh. He was like 17 or 18, and we thought he was the coolest guy in our neighborhood. I think he went into the military. I can't remember at this point, but he wasn't our babysitter anymore. We got this really hot girl for a little while, and she was seriously the woman I based all my teenage fantasies that I would have in just a couple of years. She was great, too. Then, when I was 9 or so, we got a girl I'll call Kathy. And Kathy was kind of nerdy and younger than our other babysitters, and we liked her, but she was also nice. I think she was more like 14, though. One night, she was going to spend the night at my house, as my parents had some conference out of town, and they were going to spend the night there rather than drive home really late. Kathy had a friend come over, and I don't think she was supposed to, but Jake and I didn't say anything. We were just going to watch TV and eat popcorn and stuff. This was back when all those shows were on Saturday nights, like Fantasy Island and Love Boat and that kind of thing. So anyway, this other teenager I'll call Tina comes over, and they're in the kitchen talking, and we're just watching TV. They come into the room, and Kathy asks if we want to play a game or something. It was still light out, just getting to be dark, and Jake for some reason wanted to play hide and seek, so we all went outside. My neighborhood had a lot of houses, but there was nothing behind us except fields. We had a shed and an old barn in back, but my dad didn't like us playing in the barn as it was kind of run down. So I tell Jake he has to be it first, as he wanted to play, and the rest of us would run and hide. I knew he knew the barn was off limits, and there was this little room off the back that I could hide in, and he never would look there. It was kind of like a storage shed that my dad kept tools and stuff in. I sneaked in and closed the door, which I suppose was totally unfair, and this is where things got creepy. As I'm sitting there on a stool, In comes Tina, and she has her finger up to her lips. I didn't say anything, and we were just waiting there in the dark. This is when she convinced me that we should turn this into a cops and robbers game, and that we can get Jake and Kathy if they get near this back building behind the barn. I say okay, and she says she'll pretend she's the robber and captures me, and I go along with it. I mean, I was just a kid. So she gets some rope and ties my legs together, and then ties my hands behind my back and has me sit on the floor. She went to the door and peeked outside, and then came back over to me as I heard Kathy calling out for us. This girl got down next to me and covered my mouth with her hand and says to be quiet and to wait for them. Again, I'm thinking this is just a game and go along with it. After a minute, she grabbed a roll of black tape and put a piece over my mouth and goes back to the door. Now I'm starting to think this is weird, and I start trying to talk, but obviously can't. She came back over to me and took a plastic bag and put it over my head, and then walked back to the door and went out. I mean, I'm not bullshitting. I'm a little kid tied up on the floor with a bag over my head that's making it hard to breathe. Now I'm freaking out and starting to cry and trying to breathe and get out of the ropes. Tina comes back in and takes the bag off, and she's smiling and laughing and telling me to stop crying. It's just a game. She untied me, and I'm really crying now, and she tells me she'll give me $2 if I stop and not tell anyone. I get it together and promise I won't say anything. Shit, it was $2. Right, stupid kid logic. So we leave and go back to the house where Kathy and Jake are, and they started asking where we were hiding, but I didn't say anything. Later that night, Jake says he's got to pee and goes upstairs. We were watching something on TV, and I didn't notice that Tina went up behind him. Kathy asked if I wanted popcorn, so we went into the kitchen to make it. We got back to the living room, and Tina was just sitting there watching TV, and we joined her. Again, I didn't think about Jake right away. But then I noticed he wasn't around, and I said, "Hey, where'd Jake go?" And Tina said he went to bed. I thought it was odd, but it wasn't for another half hour or so that I got up to see if he was in bed. Tina told me to stay down there and not wake him up, and I thought about earlier in the night and what had happened. I ran upstairs and into our room, and he wasn't there. I looked in our closet and under the beds and then into my parents' room, and he wasn't there either, and he wasn't in the bathroom. Then I thought I heard something in the closet, and I opened the door with Kathy right behind me. Our clothes hamper was in there with a heavy shelf on the lid, and my brother was inside the hamper. Tina had tied him up with my mom's pantyhose and put him in there, put the shelf on the lid so he couldn't get out, and just left. Jake was crying and freaking out, and Kathy did her best to calm him down, and we went back downstairs to yell at Tina, who obviously did this. But she wasn't there. She had left and went home. I told Kathy what had happened to me earlier, and she called Tina's house, but I guess no one answered. Anyway, Kathy stayed with us the rest of the night and didn't let us out of her sight. We told my parents, and my mom had some choice words for Tina's parents, and also for Kathy for letting that girl even come around. I don't know what happened to that girl, who's now a woman, but I'll never forget that night. I suppose it's not scary to an adult or anyone listening to this, but it was creepy as a kid. I mean, what would have happened if she had stayed later and we fell asleep? I don't even want to think about that. I had nightmares about not being able to breathe for a long time after that. We don't really talk about it, but every once in a while Jake brings her up to me, and I wonder if that fucking psycho woman is out there abusing anybody else. Terrifying Church Party, submitted by Toby. I grew up in a big city in Missouri, and my family was really religious. I'm not now and wasn't really into church back then either, but my parents made me and my siblings do all kinds of church stuff. Choir, youth group, all that stuff. My parents weren't really into Halloween, and we would have to beg to dress up and go trick-or-treating. They thought all of it was evil and that sort of thing. One year, they decided my brother and I were going to a party being held at the church that we went to. It was a costume thing, but they didn't call it Halloween. They called it something else, I don't remember. I was 13 and my brother was 11 at the time. The church always had these anti-fun Halloween parties that were lame as shit. My parents forced us to go to this one, and we were supposed to dress up like shepherds, but we secretly bought these devil horns, some vampire teeth, and 2 black capes at a 5 and 10 store in town. We planned to smuggle everything under these robe outfits my aunt made us, and then change into our stuff in the bathroom, and then come whooping out at everyone at the party. We got out of the house with our gear and walked to the church laughing and talking about how pissed everyone was going to be and betting on how scared some of the people would be. We got to the church and it wasn't super old, but it wasn't new either. The older part was where all the services and stuff were, and the newer part was like a rec hall with these dividers in it to make Sunday school classrooms. There was a tall steeple at the front end of the old part of the building with a bell, and I think you probably get the picture. So we get there, and I see my friend Alex is there too, and he's another guy who hates this church shit. We actually thought about ditching and going trick-or-treating, but we knew our parents would find out and we'd be in trouble. My dad was actually pretty cool, and we figured he would actually laugh at what we were about to do, and he would handle my mother, who would no doubt be pissed. I let Alex in on what we were going to do, and he says he'll help by turning off the lights in the hall and then turning them back on as we come screaming into the room. We're almost crying right at that point because of how fucking funny this is going to be. We go inside and hang around for a while, and there's a bunch of kids and adults playing games and stuff, and we can barely contain ourselves. Around 9 o'clock, it's really dark outside, and we make our plan. We run into the rec hall, out the other side, run down the stairs, backtrack under the rec hall, come back out on the other side through an entrance that goes into the church part and out the front of the church. Piece of cake if we don't die from laughing. My brother and I wander off slowly and go into a bathroom down the hall from the rec room and put on our stuff. Alex goes to the far end of the hall where he'll turn the light switches off, and the plan is he'll hit the lights, count to 10, and then he'll snap them back on. We'll count to 8 and start running into the rec hall screaming and hollering. So the plan comes off flawlessly. Alex kills the lights, we start running, and the lights come back on. We're screaming and running at kids and parents and waving our arms and lunging at them. A bunch of them screamed, including some of the older guys, and one kid pissed his pants. I could see the wet patch on him as I ran by. We booked it out the door near Alex, and he's already a little ahead of us going down the stairs. We cross under the rec hall and pop out into the church and run between the pews to the front door. And this is where our little prank went sideways. The front doors were locked and there was a chain on the handles. Shit. We can hear people running around looking for us, and we know they're not happy with our awesome stunt. We're desperate. If we go back into the church from this foyer, we can probably squeeze out a window, but the stained glass windows were small and it wouldn't be quick. Plus, we might break one, and even I didn't want that to happen. We're looking around, and my brother spots a trapdoor in the ceiling with a rope and a ball on the end of it, hanging down. If one of us jumps off a chair, we can pull it down and maybe hide there to give us more time to figure out what the hell we're going to do. I do it. I grab the rope and pull down a folding staircase. The voices are getting louder, and we run up the stairs only to find a ladder going straight to the top of the steeple. We didn't have a choice, and Alex went first. I went second, and my brother brought up the rear. He pulled up the staircase and the trapdoor shut, and we go up a few more rungs on the ladder. A minute or so later, we hear people right underneath us, and one of them says, with a very unchurch-like, "Where are those little bastards?" After a little bit, they leave, and we all sigh with relief. I tell my brother to push the staircase down, but it won't budge. He tries to push it down with his foot, but nothing is happening. Okay, now we're in serious shit. This ladder we're on is starting to creak, and it's not meant to hold 3 people like this. It was old as hell. "Maybe the door needs more weight," says Alex, and I reply I'll give it a shot, but there's no way to switch places with my brother. "We have to go up and see if we can switch there," I said, and we slowly made our way up this piece of shit old-ass ladder, and it's creaking and sounding like it's going to give way. But we get to the top, and there's nothing but a hatch to the outside. Double fuck. So either we go out on the roof and switch places, or go down and scream for help and take our chance that way. "This can't be too bad," I said, and Alex popped the hatch. The roof is steep as all hell, but he says if we hold on to the wooden slats surrounding the bell of the steeple, we should be okay. He offers to skirt the bell tower. We can come out, and he'll go around the entire thing and then back down the ladder. I'll open the trap door and then call for you to come down. We shouldn't be on the ladder at the same time again. That thing's a chunk," he says. We get after things, and I cannot believe how high up we are, how dangerous this is, not to mention totally fucking stupid. When my brother gets out there with me, I'm wishing we had just called for help. Alex makes his way around the tower and gets back into the shaft with the ladder. After a few minutes, he's back at the top of the ladder saying we're all set to go. Let's go back down. That's when the slap my brother was clinging to snapped, and he started to slide down the roof into his certain doom. In the blink of an eye, I shot out my leg to him, and he grabbed it and was too scared to scream. But even in the dark, I could see his face was white as snow. With all my strength, I slowly pulled my leg up, and it was only about a foot or two to get up to the shaft, and he grabbed that with his other hand, let go of my leg, and pulled himself up, and then just sat there hanging on for dear life, breathing heavily. Tears were running down his face, and I told him to get in and get down. After a few minutes he did, and I followed him, closing the hatch. We got to the bottom, met Alex there, and closed the staircase again. We sneaked back into the church, got to the nearest window and flopped it open. We squeezed out and landed in a heap outside of the church and just lay there panting. We all made our way back to our houses, and yeah, we all got the tar beat out of us for our stunt. Oh well. My brother and I didn't tell our parents what really happened until we were in our 30s, and my mother almost fainted. My dad laughed and said we were idiots. No ghosts and goblins in this, but holy shit, that was the scariest thing that's ever happened to me on a Halloween night. My Stalker at Work, submitted by Vector EPS. I'm going to start out by saying that I'm a gay male and a graphic artist to give people an idea of where I'm coming from. I heard a story on Uncle Josh a while back about a gay guy who had a stalker and thought I'd share my story about a creeper I met at my old job. Thanks for reading this if you do, Uncle Josh. It was 2010 and I was 25 at the time. I took a new job at a small boutique ad agency in the city I lived in and was happy to be doing real graphic design and not the layouts I had been doing for a phone book and classified ad company. Everyone there was super nice. And there were about 20 total people that all did different things, from design to public relations and media buying. And there were also the sales team, and we called them account managers. One of the account managers was named Tom. He was part of the interview panel I went before to determine if I was a good fit for the company, and even then I got weird vibes from him right off the bat. He was a good-looking guy in his 30s that was married and had a son who he talked about all the time. But there was a side of him that I don't think too many people knew about until what I'm going to tell you came to light. Tom was overly interested in me from the get-go. During the interview process, he would stare at me and afterwards ask me odd questions as I was leaving the office. Stuff about my personal life, and while it wasn't really intrusive, it seemed a little inappropriate. Like if I had a girlfriend and stuff like that. I don't expect people to know that I'm gay, but it just felt a little weird. So I got hired, and the phone call with my boss Andy was really cool, and I was excited to get things rolling. I left my old job, and on the last day there, I got a call from Tom. He said he was very happy that I was coming on board, and that I'd be working for a lot of his accounts. I thought this was odd, as he must have looked up my then current employer somehow and called, because he didn't have my cell, and he didn't call that, and he obviously didn't know it. I chalked it up to a guy being overzealous and loving his job, but it still was kind of weird. So my first day of work was easy, meeting people and talking with the account team and just getting settled in. And here comes Tom. A bunch of people were going to walk up the street to a restaurant for lunch, and he invited me to go, even though 4 other people had already asked me. Again, not an issue, but it was odd, seeing as he was with us when they first asked me. We go to the lunch place, and Tom makes a point to sit right next to me, and kept offering me a taste of the food he got. I politely said no thanks, but he kept bringing it up until I finally just laughed and told him to take off. If that doesn't let you know I'm from Canada, I don't know what will. So the week goes by, and Tom makes it a habit to stop by my desk at least twice a day, and keeps asking about girlfriends and such. And now I just laugh and blow him off, but in a nice way. That Friday night, a couple of people were going to happy hour and asked if I wanted to go, and I said sure. They were a really nice group of people, and we are all still good friends, even though I'm now working as a freelancer. Somehow Tom heard about happy hour and goes also. We're all walking down the street to this cool, trendy bar, and I have a couple of beers, but I knew that I had to go to the gym before meeting friends for a late dinner and some cocktails. I mentioned this to my new friend Ben, and Tom immediately jumped in and started asking me what gym I went to, and what kinds of clothes I like to work out in. Just goofy shit like that. I mean, sneakers would be one thing, but he was asking if I like spandex shorts and things like that. I called it a night right there and said goodbye to everyone and left for the gym. I got a workout in, went home to my apartment and showered before heading out to see my friends. I was excited to tell them all about my new job, so we got a bite and then hung out at some place to have some drinks. When I got to my part about Tom, my friend Chris laughed and said the guy sounded like a creeper, and that's when I hear Tom's voice ask out loud, "Who's a creeper?" He had somehow found out where I was going and pretended to just be popping in to meet someone, but he never really did meet anyone. He just stood around with me and my friends. And he didn't really say anything either, and it was super awkward. When my friend Walt asked him where the person he was supposed to be there to see was, Tom mumbled something and said goodnight and walked away. On Monday, I didn't see much of Tom, which was weird, but I didn't complain. On Tuesday morning, I got in to find a package on my chair, and when I opened it, it was a pair of really skimpy men's underwear. No note or nothing. I'd figured maybe it was some kind of joke, but when I brought it up to everyone else, no one said anything. Later that day, I got a text from an unknown number, and it just said, "Like your present?" I texted back, "Who is this?" but got no response. I forgot about it because Andy asked me to come up with my own ideas about a new product line for one of our clients, and I was charged up to impress him and the owner of the ad agency. Everyone was leaving for the night, but I kept going. I was in the zone and didn't want to stop the creative vibe. And then my phone went off. An unknown number again, and a text that said, "Working late, huh?" Again, I responded with, "Who is this?" But nothing happened. I decided to wrap things up and left for home. I said goodnight to the owner as he was still there, and he asked me how things were going so far. I told him it was good, and he said to come to him with anything. I was tempted to tell him about the underwear. That night I was online with a guy I liked, and I'll call him Daryl, and we were talking about being an official couple. I'd known him for a couple of years, but we didn't get together until recently. We were chatting away, making plans for the weekend, when I looked at my phone that was buzzing on my nightstand. I hadn't heard it, but there were 15 messages from an unknown number. There were a few, "What are you up to's?" and "Why aren't you answering?" and then a bunch of D pics. I told Daryl about it, and he told me to save everything but not to respond. I didn't, said goodbye to him, and my phone buzzed again. It was another message asking where I was and if I liked what I saw. The next day I showed Andy my preliminary work, and he liked it and said to keep developing it with a couple of changes, so I was happy about that. When I sat back down, I felt someone come up behind me, and I smelled the cologne Polo, and someone who had obviously put on way too much. Guess who? Tom. He leaned over me really close and asked if I was going to make his client happy. I calmly leaned back to let him know that he was too close, and he moved over to the side of my desk and sat down. It was odd, but what I was working on was for one of his accounts. He kept it professional and said that it was great to have me on board. Later that night, I got another crotch pick, but this time the person was wearing the underwear that was sent to me the other day. I immediately knew it had to have been someone from work. When I went in the next day, I looked in the drawer I had thrown those things in, and they weren't there. Red alert, I know. But I was already uncomfortable getting them and didn't want to make waves as a new employee. My mind would change about that pretty quick. Things got creepier as Tom somehow figured out what gym I went to, and he joined it too. We would see each other there and say hi, but as soon as I finished a workout, he would stop too and bump into me in the locker room, even though he'd only been there for 15 minutes. He always asked if I showered there, and I told him I just went home. Again, just kind of icky. The text messages kept coming, and I finally texted back, "Tom, stop it. This isn't funny or cool. If you keep bothering me, I'm talking to Andy about this." The text stopped, and Tom rarely talked to me at work, for a couple of weeks, outside of group meetings about project progress. Then, one night, Daryl was over at my apartment and my phone rings. It rang for phone calls, and it was also how people accessed my apartment building, too. It was Tom. He says he needs to talk to me, and I tell him I'm really busy and can't right that minute, and he replied that it was urgent. I again told him no, and Daryl grabbed the phone and told him to go away. I heard Tom scream into the phone, "Let me the fuck in this building!" Daryl hung up the phone, and immediately it rang again, but we didn't answer it. I was freaking out, saying I was going to call the cops, and then Daryl asks, "What if someone else lets him in?" My face went white, and I said, "Let's get out of here, go someplace public, and we can call the police from there." I know it sounds weird, but I didn't want to be trapped in my apartment, and thought going to a cafe bar up the street would be a better place to be. The phone kept ringing, and I can hear Tom leaving threatening messages on my answering machine. I grabbed my wallet and cell phone, and we left my place, and Daryl suggested we take the stairs in case Tom somehow did get into the building. I lived on the 8th floor, so we started making our way down the stairs, and when we got into the main hallway downstairs, we saw Tom getting into the elevator with someone else who obviously let him in. He turned and looked at us as the doors shut, and he yelled out, I'm sure scaring the hell out of my neighbor. We ran for the door and hit the street, busting out of there, totally freaking out. Daryl and I went to the cafe and immediately went to the back, away from the windows. I called 911 and tell the guy what's going on, that this Tom guy has been harassing me and is now in my apartment building, and we also told him where we were. He told me to stay put and wait for officers to show up. During this time, Daryl had went to the front and came back saying that Tom was walking up and down the street looking into all the windows of the bars and shops. I crouched down and put my hood on my sweatshirt up, shaking. I'm in great shape and very well built, if I may say so, but I don't want to get into a fight or confront this guy who's obviously messed up. 2 officers finally got there, and we gave them the update of what was going on and that Tom was no longer in my building. They took down all of my information and asked if I could stay someplace else that night instead of going home. Daryl said I could stay with him, and they advised me we go straight there and to call if anything else happens. But there's not much they can do because he didn't physically threaten us, and he didn't break into my building technically. I'm pissed now more than scared, but agree, and we leave the place and start the 6 or 7 block walk to Daryl's apartment. He lived above a liquor store, so we were just going to get some booze and chill at his place watching movies while we figured out what I was going to do the next day. About halfway there, we hear running footsteps, and I look over my shoulder to see Tom running at us. He's wearing nothing but a trench coat and boots, and I mean nothing else. Although I was freaking out, I did kind of let out a shrill laugh, as this was kind of funny, although terrifying at the same time. We took off like rockets, and he couldn't keep up. So we skipped the booze and got into Daryl's apartment, and I called the police again, and they are there in record time and actually caught Tom. They asked us to come down and identify him as he was sitting in a car, and they shine lights in his face and we say, yeah, that's him. He kept trying to say something through the half-open window, but the police kept telling him to shut up. In the pockets of his coat, he had zip ties and a knife, and I saw them sitting on the hood of the car. That really tripped me out. That night I called Andy and told him what was going on, and he was blown away. He had known Tom for years and couldn't believe what was happening. On Monday, the owner called me and Andy into his office, as Andy had talked to him over the weekend about what was going on. Tom didn't come into work, and basically after seeing the texts and hearing about what Tom was doing and how he was always creeping around me, he was fired. Last I heard, his wife had left him, and this was not his first foray into harassing young guys. He had been caught in a local park with another guy forcibly trying to have sex with him. And why he wasn't in jail for that, I don't know. But it turns out his wife knew he had sexual leanings towards men, but he had a good job, and she didn't want to work. As crazy as this was, the thing that still freaks me out is the zip ties and knife. What would have happened to me if he had gotten into my apartment? What if I had let him in innocently? What if Daryl wasn't there? Like I said, I'm no longer at that job, but I'm still friends with all those people. But I never want to meet Tom again. The Maniac in the Mangroves. Submitted by Aussie Jim 45. For this story, I'll call myself Jim, although that's not my real name. This happened when I was about 15, and my two friends, Greg and Tiny, were going out to the mangroves to look for mud crabs and just fuck off for a bit. We called Tiny that because even though he was 15, he was about 6'2" and could already grow a beard. So we get our stuff together and head out on our dirt bikes looking for adventure. If you're not familiar with how all of this works, there's lots of videos on YouTube you can watch, and a lot of people go out crabbing all the time. When the tide is high, it floods the mangroves and the crabs come out and you can hunt them. They can be really big, and their claws can slice you up pretty good if they snap at you. We were waiting around not having much luck, and we stopped for a smoke, and we were just laughing and talking about girls and the shit teenage boys talk about. Greg and Tiny got into an argument about football teams, and I'm laughing as they're really going at it. Then I noticed something white flash a little ways away from us, through the mangroves. It looked like a man in a white shirt, but these things can be thick, and it was sunny out too. I didn't say anything and let those two fight it out, and I went looking for crabs. I saw one and called for the guys, and they came splashing over, and the hunt was on. You really have to get behind the crabs, and they can move pretty good, and they usually stick their claws up in defense, and if you're not paying attention, your hand's going to be bleeding right quick. Tiny has a stick and he's trying to get the crab to grab it, and it finally does, and I scoop it up from behind and check it, and it's legal, so I tossed him into a bucket Greg was holding. Now we were getting somewhere. Suddenly, the white movement catches my eye again, and I see it is a man with a camera, and he's coming towards us. He splashes up and demands to see our crab. He must have been spying on us. I shrugged and showed it to him, and at first he said it was a female. You can't keep females. I told him I wasn't a bloody clot and that I knew the difference between males and females. So then he says it's not legal. Greg shows him that it's way legal, and he just stands there a minute before wandering off. We all look at one another, and Tiny says, "Fucking loon." We get back after it, and after about 20 minutes, we find two at the same time. One was a male and one was a female. Tiny has one in his hands, and Greg has the other, and, oh boy, here comes this nut again. Before he can say anything, I jab my stick at Tiny's crab and say, "That's a male," and then point to Greg, "That's a female." The guy just looks at me and says, "I suppose you think you're funny, you little prick." Greg asks him what he wants, and just to fuck off and leave us alone. He stares at us and then whips his camera up and takes our picture. I'm taking these to the authorities and tell them that you're keeping females. He then turns and splashes away. We all shake our heads, and Tiny flips his crab into our bucket, and Greg lets the other one go. It's getting on, and I say, let's find one more and then get out of here. So we head back to where our dirt bikes were, and we hit pay dirt 3 more times, all males and all legal. That's when we hear shouting and splashing. Here comes Nutball again, and he's really pissed. "You little pricks just ruined my shot on purpose." We have no idea what he's talking about, and just start walking away to get to our bikes. He's actually almost running at us now, and getting closer, so we pick up the pace too, and get back onto dry land and near our bikes. Tiny hooks the bucket over his handlebars and starts to pedal, as so do Greg and I. But the guy is right beside us, and he throws a stick into the spokes of Greg's back wheel, and Greg crashes. The guy jumps on him and is yelling that he's taking him to the authorities. I've skidded to a stop and yell for him to leave Greg alone, but Tiny has picked up a really thick log and runs at the guy, smashing him in the side with it. The maniac lets go of Greg with an oof, and Tony winds up for another shot, and the guy puts his hands up. I don't know why I did this, but I grabbed the guy's camera that had come off his strap and ran away with it. I took the memory card out of it, and he was screaming to give it back. I walked over, threw the camera at him, and Tiny held him at bay, telling me to get the crabs onto my bike and get going. Greg's bike wasn't ruined, but the rim was a little bent, and we could still ride it, so we took off with Tiny not too far behind us. We got home and collapsed, out of breath. And then I remembered the memory card and got my laptop and put the card in. There were dozens of pictures of us out in the mangroves. and I showed my dad, who called the police. They came out and we told them our story, and they took the card, but there wasn't much they could do except to tell us to be on the lookout, and they would also be looking for the man. One cop was really cool and wanted to see our crabs, and told us he was happy we had used our heads out there, and we got out of there the way we did. He also said we were pretty talented to have that many crabs on one hunting trip. So, to that maniac out there creeping on kids, fuck off, you cunt. My first job, submitted by Dakota. My first job was in a pizzeria in my town. I was 15, and my older brother got me in as he worked there for a couple of years and was still a delivery driver. We had a lot of pizza joints in my town out in the suburbs, and all of them were always busy. I worked in the kitchen, slinging dough and making subs and wings and spaghetti. The restaurant had a big dining room, and the takeout and delivery side of things was huge on the weekends. So, I'd be there until like 8 or 9 at night, and I think that's the latest I could actually work at that time. And this was in the 80s. One Friday night, my brother was off, and the other delivery guy, Brian, was working. He was in and out all night long, and we were busy as ever. I'd been on a few runs with my brother, and back then you would take a bunch of deliveries out at the same time and try to plan things out so you were in the same neighborhood so as to maximize your time. My manager told me to punch out, and I ordered a pizza to take home and then played the Spy Hunter video game that was in the front lobby while I waited. A few minutes later, Brian heads out to kind of a crappy neighborhood to start his run and make his way back to the shop. I'm playing and playing even after my pizza was ready and sitting in a box on top of an oven. My manager came over and asked if I'd seen Brian, and I told him something like a half hour ago. He just looked strange and walked away, looking at the list of deliveries. I guess they weren't really that far away. Another 10 minutes go by, and I'm going to walk home. My manager says he'll give me a ride if I want. I said sure, and we got out to his car. At the intersection we were situated on, he made a left turn instead of a right, and I told him, "Ron, you know I live the other way." "I know," he said back, "but I just thought of something. I'll only be a minute or two." I shrugged. It was Friday night, my girlfriend was at her mom's house out of town, so I didn't really care. After a few minutes of driving, I start to see where he's heading and ask him what's up. 2 people on that 4 delivery run called saying they didn't get their food. "Why would Brian steal food?" I asked. "I mean, you let us get it for free." I asked like the dumb 15-year-old that I was. "I don't think he stole anything," Ron said. "Maybe he broke down or something, and that's what I'm checking on." This was the 80s, and the only cell phone I had ever seen back then was in the movies, and they were those big bag phones, if anyone else remembers them. We still used pay phones, and hey, they were only a dime. So Ron's looking at his list and goes to a delivery spot, and jumps out of the car and runs up to the door and talks to a guy who answers it for a minute. He gets back to his car, and I asked if they got their food, and he nodded. We drove to the next place, and it's in the shittier part I mentioned. Half the streetlights are out, lots of old businesses are boarded up, and in between them are run-down houses. Now, look, I'm not saying the people who lived there were bad or anything, but it was just a rougher place than anywhere else in my town. Ron looked ahead and said, "Oh, shit." It was Brian's car, still running, but he wasn't in it. Ron parked and said to stay in the car, and got out to see where Brian was. He looked in the car and then looked up at the house and went over to knock on the door. No one answered, and he cupped his hands around his eyes trying to see in, and he looked startled. I could tell even though I was a little ways away. Ron yanked the screen door open and pushed the other one in and disappeared into the house. He was back in a second, running towards me, and I rolled down the window. "All right, get to someone's house now. Get to someone's house right now and call the cops. Now! Go! Now!" Again, 15-year-old me says, "Why? What's going on?" "Just fucking do it!" he yelled, and ran back to the house and went inside. I jumped out and ran to the nearest house that had lights on, which was just up the ways. I banged on the door, and I'll never forget a woman answered, and I told her to call the police because there was something wrong with the pizza delivery. Yeah, I still haven't lived that one-liner down. I was such an idiot. I finally got it out that our delivery guy was in trouble, and she called the cops for me. They showed up in less than 5 minutes and wanted to know what was going on. I told them that my manager was inside a house, and I pointed to it and said that something was wrong with our driver. They went in, and I was standing on the stoop trying to see in, but I couldn't. One of the cops came out and asked me my name, where I lived, were my parents home, what was I doing here, that kind of thing. I told him everything I could, and he got back in his car and got on his radio, and then got out and told me to have a seat in the back of his car. I did, and he said everything was okay, my parents would be there in a minute. Then an ambulance pulled up, and another cop car, and then another cop car. Ron came back out and stood by the car I was in, and I asked him what was going on through the half-rolled-down window. "Brian's hurt pretty bad," was all Ron said. Again, I couldn't see well, but they rolled Brian out on a stretcher and into the ambulance. My dad came up in his car and talked to the cop who talked to me, and he told me to get into our car and that we were going home. He then said something to Ron and pointed his finger at him, and he didn't look happy at all. He got back in our car, yelled at me for not going straight home after my shift, and when we got home, he told me to go straight to my room. I remember asking if I could take a shower, and he said he didn't give a shit as long as I was out of his sight. I did, and then went to my room feeling bad and scared, and not knowing what I had done wrong. I hated when my dad was mad at me. Anyway, he came up to my room later and poked his head in the door, and he saw I was awake, so he sat down on my bed and said he wasn't mad at me, and he was mad at Ron, but I shouldn't have gone out looking for Brian with him at that time of night. He gave me a chuck on the shoulder and told me to hit the sack and we'd talk more in the morning. I couldn't sleep, and my brother came home around 1:30 and came in and asked if I was awake. I said yeah, and asked if he knew what had happened, and that I was super confused. He said yes, he had been at the shop that night and had talked to Ron. He produced 2 beers and cracked one and handed it to me and opened his. And this had never happened before. My mom would have been pissed, but their bedroom was downstairs, so they never found out. He was just trying to calm me down. So the story was, Brian had gone on his delivery, and when he got to that house, no one answered the front door. So he went to the side door, and that's when he got jumped by someone or some people. The cops think there was more than 2 or 3 people involved. They dragged him inside, stabbed him twice in the side, and then beat the tar out of him. Whoever it was then tied him to a chair, put tape over his mouth, and took his roll for the pizzeria and his wallet. Then they rigged up a rope around his neck to an overhead light in the room. They had beaten him so bad that he could barely keep his head up, and he was basically choking himself to death when Ron found him. "Is he going to be okay?" I asked. "I think so," said my brother. "He's in the hospital, but from what Ron told me, he's going to be all right." I sipped my beer, and then the tears came out. It then dawned on me why my dad was so pissed. What if those people were still around while I was out there running around? What if they got Ron and then I went in that house too? What if Brian wasn't on that night? What if it was my brother that was driving? My brother hung out with me for a while and told me that it wasn't my fault and said, "You know how Dad gets." The next morning, my dad took me to get haircuts and we went to a diner for breakfast. He told me he was proud that I had helped the police last night, but that I wasn't going to work at that pizzeria anymore. He'd help me get a job someplace else, and he did. The next week, I started at a greenhouse in town. Ron came over later that day, and my dad and I were in the front yard of our house doing yard work. He apologized to my dad and to me for not thinking things through, and he was just worried about Brian. My dad shook his hand, told him it was okay, and then told him that I wasn't going to be working there anymore, and Ron said that he understood that. Brian was okay after a few weeks in the hospital. He never got a good look at the people who did what they did, but was pretty sure there were 4 of them. The creepier thing is that house was vacant, and the police found a refrigerator that had a bunch of bloody knives and hammers and stuff inside, and that there were blood stains all over the basement floor and some furniture that was down there. The other question was, why didn't they take Brian's car? They never caught the people, by the way. So, that's my story. Well, I guess it's more of Brian's story, but that was one crazy night. I haven't seen Brian in at least 30 years, and wherever he is, I hope he's doing well, but I can understand if he's not. Crazy Guy on My Farm. Submitted by RolfDog33. I grew up on a farm in rural Tennessee with my dad and then my stepmom and sister. My mom got sick and died when I was 2, so I don't really remember her, but I miss her if that makes any sense. For a while it was just me and my dad, and at an early age I started working on the farm, doing little things until I was about 10, and then I started operating our trucks and tractors and whatnot. It was a mixed-use farm, so we had cattle and crops, and we had about 5 hands, and most of them were really good. This story happened when I was 16. My dad met my stepmom when I was 9, and he liked her a lot and brought her around to meet me, and then talked to me about him remarrying and if I understood what was going on. I did, and I liked her very much. My stepsister was only 4 at the time, and she would follow me around everywhere I went on the farm. Everyone called Sally my little shadow. I called her Sprout. We didn't have lots of neighbors, but were familiar with everyone who lived around us and had great relationships with them. They were mostly farmers too, but my best friend Curtis wasn't. His dad was in the oil business and they were super rich. Living way out here, neither Sally or I had many friends around, but we both had school friends, and when I started to get into sports, that really upped the people I hung out with. Over time, I got to know my stepmom better, but I didn't ask about her past, and it was never a topic of conversation. As I mentioned, she was very nice. Every year my dad would go to this big convention for a few days to look at new equipment and such. He was usually gone for 3 days, and the hands would take care of things, and my grandparents would come and stay with me, and later when Kathy came into the picture, she would stay back with us kids. But one year, when I turned 16, Dad wanted to take Kathy along and asked if I thought I could handle taking care of Sally in the house. The perk? I didn't have to do anything on the farm for 5 days. Hell yeah, I was in. They planned to fly out to California for the expo the night before the show, and then stay 2 days after and come home Saturday in the afternoon. I was really into cooking, and told Sally about all the cool stuff I was going to make for her and how much fun we would have. She was 11 and excited, but it was also the first time her mom had ever been away from her for more than one night. The day came, and one of the hands drove my parents to the airport, and I made dinner. It was a school night, so we just watched some TV and hung out, and I told her she had to go to bed at 9, and she was tired anyway. And I stayed up on my computer talking to Curtis on Skype for a while. He had only lived out here for 2 years and was still kind of the new guy at school. He had a crush on my other friend Denise, who we all called Dixie for some reason. I told him I had her Skype handle, but I didn't want to give it to him without her knowing. So I hatched a plan to get them together if he could come over on Friday night. I was in love with her sister, Mara. I called my dad in California the next day and asked if Curtis could stay over on Friday night. I begged and told him that Chuck, our main hand, didn't live far away if there was an emergency. Curtis' parents were home, how good I was in school, my work on the farm, man, you name it, I threw it in there. He talked to Kathy and said as long as it was just him, it would be okay. Alright, Jesus, this is long, but it's important for the story. We never told Curtis' parents we were the only ones home, just that my parents said it was okay, and we did end up getting in trouble for that oversight. Friday came, and Sally was missing her mom, and I've been doing my best to keep her occupied and making all of her favorite foods. So Friday night, she said she wanted hot dogs and my homemade mac and cheese. Curtis came home on the bus with us directly from school, and we messed around outside for a while, but it was February and cold. To make Sally happy, I did make her dinner as it was getting dark, and then I put on her favorite movie. And Curtis and I went to my room and got on Skype. I told Dixie we would call her around 7, but she said she couldn't talk until later. We ate dinner and played Uno with Sally, and around 9:30 I told her it was time for bed, but she could watch TV in her room. Off she went, and I sneaked to the kitchen to grab a few Budweisers from the fridge. Curtis was sitting in my room, and when he saw the beer, he laughed and pulled out a bottle of Crown Royal booze he had sneaked out of his house. Mind you, we had never really drank before, but were just experimenting. "Can we drink both of these things?" I asked. Curtis said to take a swig of the whiskey and then the beer, and that was called a Boilermaker. Why not? And oh, the fire in my throat and belly. We laughed and Skyped Dixie and Mara. They were in her room and we talked and talked, but as we would step away from the camera to have another Boilermaker, they kept asking us what we were doing. After a few of those, we were getting that lightheaded feeling and saying stupid things, and it became apparent what was going on. Dixie then asked, "What was that in your window?" My bedroom is on the first floor. It used to be a sun porch. All of the other bedrooms were on the second floor of the house. My desk was against a wall with my computer facing the windows behind me, and most of them had curtains, but directly behind me they were open. I was buzzed and said, "What?" "There was a face in the window just a minute ago," said Dixie. I thought maybe it was Chuck and told Curtis to hide the stuff. I got up and woozily went to the window, but there was no one there. I noticed the wind was picking up and it looked like a storm was coming. "Nobody home," I remembered saying, and everyone laughed. Then the lights went out at Dixie's, and she said they had just lost power. Her laptop still had a charge, and after talking to her parents, she stayed online with us. "There it is again!" she cried out. Curtis turned faster than me and said, "Holy shit, who is that?" I caught a flash of a beard, but that was it. None of the farmhands had beards, and there was no reason any of them would be out at the farm this late on a Friday night. I turned the lights off and put my laptop down on the floor, and Curtis got down too as I looked out of all the windows. I couldn't see anything, but then there was a pounding on the front door. We almost shit, it startled us so much. I went to the door and looked out the frosted glass on one side of it, and there was a big guy standing out there. I couldn't see who it was, even though the porch light was on and my hallway light was not. "Who is it?" I asked. "I need to see Sally," said the man. Who are you?" "Open the door." I checked the lock, the deadbolt, and the chain on the door. All were set. Sally's not here. She's at a friend's house. Sorry." I said this, wondering who the hell this guy was. "Open the door." "I can't do that. Have a good night," I said, and turned the porch light off. He pounded on the door again and yelled, "Open the goddamn door or I'll bust it in." I backed away and ran to my room to get Curtis. He heard the last part of that and was like, "What's going on?" I told him to help me check the windows and doors to see if they were all locked, and the minute we went into the living room, our power went out. The guy was still banging on the door and yelling as we fumbled through the dark room, buzzing and having that slow motion effect going on. I checked the kitchen door. It was locked, and all the windows and everything else was secure. The banging stopped. Curtis and I joined up in the living room again, and I was getting ready to call my dad when there was a flash of lightning, and we saw the guy standing outside the dining room window that was open to where we were. He was tall enough so that his face was in the window, and he was a big, big dude. He moved to the back door and yelled that he was there for Sally. I immediately ran upstairs to her, and she had fallen asleep watching TV. I crept to her in the darkness and whispered, "Wake up, Sprout, wake up." She flinched a bit and then said, "What's going on? Why are you in my room?" I said, "Shut up and listen to me, Sprout. You have to get up. Something's wrong and we need to hide." There was a sound of breaking glass downstairs, and I pulled her out of bed and tried to think what I could do to get her to the basement and hide in my dad's hunting room. It had a massive steel door, and I knew we would be safe there. I told her to follow me and grabbed her hand. Now, the first room after you get up the stairs to the second floor of my house is our bathroom. So in my haze, I thought we could hide there, and chances were this guy would go to another room first, and we could make a break for it to the basement. To be honest, I had forgotten all about Curtis. I heard the guy yelling all kinds of shit like, "Get your ass out here, you little shit! I want Sally now!" He was banging into furniture in the dark, and then I knew he was in my room looking, because I had set up some dominoes in a line and they all went down clicking. Then he was back in the living room. He just stood there and called out so sickly sweet, "Sally! Where are you, little darling?" Sally was shaking and starting to cry, but I told her, "You have to keep quiet, Sprout." Footsteps came up the stairs and we froze solid. I saw his dark shape go past the crack in the door. He had a big knife in his hand. "Where are you, sweetheart?" he sang out. I waited and waited until I knew he was in my parents' room, and I whispered, "Sprout, now, Dad's room in the basement." She didn't want to leave me, so I pushed her a little and followed her out. Blindly, we ran down the steps, and in my stupor that was wearing off pretty fast, I knocked a chair over at the foot of the stairs as Sally shot across the room. Curtis saw us from the doorway of my room and came out. He had hidden in my closet. "Follow me!" I screamed as the sound of running steps came down the stairs. The guy hit the chair and yelled out as he tripped and slammed into the floor. I didn't look back as Curtis and I ran to the kitchen, and that's where the basement door was. Slamming it shut behind us, we flew down the stairs, and I led Curtis across the basement to my dad's hunting room. We got in, and Sally was there, and she was crying. I pushed the door closed and locked it. The sound of stuff breaking upstairs was terrifying, but not as much as the basement door crashing open. I held my little Sprout as she shook and cried, and that's when Curtis saved the day. He had my laptop under his arm. He opened it and immediately tried to get a hold of Dixie and Mara, and while he was doing that, the light shone on in my dad's gun rack. I ran over to it, but the chain kept everything locked down. The guy was now at the door beating the hell out of it, screaming for Sally and that she was coming with him. Then I remembered my dad kept a Ruger Bearcat in a secret spot under his workbench, so I felt around for it. It was there, and I pulled it out. It's only a fancy .22, but I was ready to use it to protect my sister. The guy was still smashing into the door, and Curtis got in touch with the girls and told them to call the police for us. And both of our cell phones were upstairs. They kept asking questions, and Curtis just screamed, "Call the fucking sheriff!" The guy stopped for a second and said, "They'll never get here in time," and started screaming, "Sally, Sally, come out here!" and started smashing the door again. After a few minutes of Sally standing there with her hands over her ears, tears streaming and about to scream, Dixie said her parents called and they were on their way, and they were coming out too. "What the fuck for?" I yelled. Then it was quiet. A soft tap on the door. "Sally," he whispered, "it's time to come out. It's time to come home." More silence. Then he screamed again and pounded on the wall next to the door. It was only drywall and studs, so I took a chance and shot near where I thought he was. Yeah, stupid thing to do, but I did it. The shot was so fucking loud and Sally screamed, and we heard the guy just yell out, "Jesus Christ!" and then a lot more cursing and stumbling around. "Open that door!" he yelled from what I knew was across the basement. "Sally! Sally!" It took another 15 minutes before we faintly heard sirens and then the footsteps upstairs. I yelled that we were in the basement, but I didn't know if they would hear us. But it didn't take long for them to get down there, and we heard voices shouting, "Freeze! Don't you move!" There were more commands and a knock at the door. "You kids in there?" said a deep voice. Not the guy. "Yeah," I said, and opened the door. And there stood a sheriff with a flashlight. And the next thing he said was, "Christ, kid, put that fucking gun down!" I forgot I was still holding it. I put it on the bench and he told us to come out. Suddenly the power came back on upstairs, so another sheriff looked for our light switch in the basement and flicked it on. The room was a mess with blood all over the place, and the strange man was standing against the wall with blood all over his hand, and his pant leg and jacket were soaked. "Who is that?" I asked the sheriff, but they told us to just go upstairs and helped us up. Dixie's parents pulled up, and I knew I had to call my dad. The police wouldn't let them in. I got a hold of my dad, and halfway through my terrified and disjointed talking, a sheriff took the phone from me and started speaking to my dad. The conversation went on for a while, and the sheriff handed the phone back to me, and my dad told me to calm down. Sally and I were okay now, and to call Grandma and Grandpa to come get us. He and Kathy were going to fly home that night. It was only 8:30 on the West Coast. An ambulance pulled up, and the sheriff led the guy out, and he looked at us and said, "Sally," before the guys took him away. I asked Sally if she knew who he was, and she didn't. The sheriffs were there into the night asking us what had happened and that my dad had given me permission to tell them, but I knew there was going to be a lot more questions in the future. Sally clung to me all through this, and I just kept interrupting my story to the cops saying, "It's okay, Sprout, it's okay." My grandparents came and got us after looking around in horror at us and the house. I asked if I could get some stuff for me and Sprout, and the sheriff went with me to my room. He paused, looking at the beer in the bottle, and shook his head. "Put that in the closet, son. No one needs to know about it." I gathered up some clothes and our toothbrushes, and we left with my grandparents. They took Curtis home, who looked just as much in shock as we did. Dad got home the next day, and I had to talk to the sheriffs again, and my parents were in disbelief of the entire story. Kathy knew who the guy was after we described him. He was Sally's biological father. When Sally was only 1, Kathy had left this guy for physical abuse, and that coupled with his drug habit and dealing, he was barred from seeing Sally or Kathy. A few months later, he got nailed on another offense and was sent to state prison. However, through some technicality, his 20-year sentence got knocked down to 10 years, and he was let out even earlier than that. For the past 2 years, he had been searching for my stepmom and his daughter. Needless to say, he found us, and at the worst time, too. I was not charged for discharging my dad's Ruger, and it was by pure luck that it went through the wall and hit the guy in the hand. Subsequently, his name was Luke, but who cares? He's back in prison, and this time I don't think he'll be weaseling out of his sentence. He tried sending letters to Sally, but the prison finally stopped that after my parents complained. Sorry this is long, but I remembered every detail of that night, even though my buzzed brain at the time shouldn't have retained it all. Sally is now 25, married to a Marine, and is all grown up. We talk about that night once in a while. And yep, I still call her Sprout. Maniac Across the Street. Submitted by Tello Funky One. This guy across the street from me was a fucking maniac. I had been working my job and had saved enough money to buy a house in a reasonably priced neighborhood in a suburb of Spokane, Washington. It was a nice place that I was going to fix up and likely sell after a few years. That was the plan, and that's what I did. My next-door neighbors were a young couple that I became friends with, and on the other side was a widow who was also very nice. The guy across the street? Holy shit. Certifiable. Joe, the guy next door, warned me about him right away. He said he mainly stuck to himself, but would have outbursts on people if they did things he didn't like. For example, Joe said one time he was raking leaves and putting them into those paper yard bags, and Frank, the guy across the street, that's what I'll call him, came running out of his house screaming that he couldn't use Home Depot bags because Home Depot didn't support the war effort, and then started kicking the full bags all over the place, spilling the leaves back onto Joe's grass. And then he turned and went home. Another time, Joe's wife had a party with her girlfriends, and one of them parked in the street in front of Frank's house. He came over screaming that no one was allowed to park there, and for whatever bitch parked there had to move her car now. Instead, they called the police, who came out and talked to him. My first experience wouldn't come for a couple of months. I was working on my front porch railing one Sunday morning, and Frank came over and yelled at me for working on a Sunday. I tried to be nice, but he just kept screaming Bible passages at me until I told him he needed to stop yelling, calm down, and get off my property. So then he just went and stood in the street, saying it was a free country, and went back to screaming stuff about the Bible. I paid him no mind and went back to work. A couple of weeks later, I bought my first puppy and was playing with her on my lawn with Joe and his wife. Frank came out onto his sidewalk and yelled to me that if my dog barks at all, he's going to shoot it. I told him to fuck off, and if he so much as touched my dog, I'd break his face for him. He left. Then he started harassing the old lady next door. Just yelling rude shit like her husband died early because she was evil and he was a God-fearing man and God didn't want her to be near him. I mean, really vile, crazy crap like that. One night I was in my backyard talking to her over our fence, and Joe came out through my gate telling me that things were getting crazy. He said Frank had put up a Nazi flag and was sitting on his porch cleaning his guns. He had pointed his finger at Joe while Joe was in his front yard, and Frank yelled bang. He thought we should start documenting everything going forward, and I agreed, and that's exactly what we did. One night at about 3 in the morning, my doorbell rang, and there's Frank at the front door wearing nothing but boxer shorts, boots, and a gun on his hip. He told me to shut my dog up, who was asleep by the way, and if I didn't shut my dog up, he was going to call the police. I said, "Hey asshole, guess what? I'll take care of that for you," and slammed the door in his face. I called the cops, and he told them he was just trying to help me and that he thought my dog was locked out accidentally and was barking to get in. They didn't buy it, and they warned him again. Things progressed. Frank took to putting nails in our driveways and front yards, but we could never catch him in the act, but we knew it was him. He would put his garbage on our side of the street, and he would yell at us every time we came home from work or wherever we were coming back from. Finally, the last straw. Joe was helping me load some timber from my house early one Saturday morning, and out came Frank screaming that we were violating the noise curfew. Joe finally said, "Fuck you," and Frank ran at him and pushed him. Joe tripped and clipped his head on my truck's bumper. And that's when I went into action and swung a huge haymaker and blasted Frank in the side of his fat face, and he fell down in a heap. I immediately called the police while he lay there, and they came out and arrested him after they heard what happened. After that, we didn't see him that much, and I ended up moving a couple of years later, as was my plan. The day I was moving out, he was standing in his picture window holding a shotgun and was just staring at me as I loaded up my U-Haul. Joe was helping me move, and as we pulled out of the driveway, Frank ran out and screamed, "You're lucky you're leaving." Joe moved out not too long after me, but I think that nice lady next door is still there. Frank was a fucking maniac. I've never met anyone like that, and hopefully never will again. He Followed Me. Submitted by Kelly. Guest voice, Mahala. My name is not Kelly, but let's use it for this story. Thank you for sharing it, Uncle Josh. I'm 21 now, but this started happening at my family home when I was 16. I grew up south of Sioux Falls, South Dakota. I don't expect anyone to know where that is, so I'm not going to go into specifics, but our house was a bit outside of town in the country, and it was a great place to grow up. When I was in high school, I got a job after school at a Dollar General in town, and outside of my cheerleading, that's really where I spent most of my time. I was saving for a new car. The one I had was a hand-me-down of a hand-me-down of a hand-me-down, just an old piece of shit Honda Civic. It drove, but I wanted something more as I was planning on going to college after high school. I can't pinpoint the day exactly, but sometime during the fall of that year, when I had just started at the Dollar General, weird things also started happening at my house, and I'll get to that. One night, this guy came into my store, and he was just kind of wandering around. I remember asking him if he needed anything, but he just blushed and said no and then left the store. He came back right before we were closing, and said he remembered he needed dish detergent. He got some. I cashed him out, and he kind of just kept standing around the front door looking back at me occasionally. I asked if he needed anything else.
Sir, is there something else you'd like to purchase? We're closing soon, and I don't want you to not get what you need.
He kind of grunted and then mumbled something under his breath, but I think it was something like, "What I want isn't something for sale." And then he left. I brushed it off as nothing, and we started closing the store. I locked the front door, put the "Sorry We're Closed" sign on it, and then looked out into the parking lot. I was 100% sure, but I also couldn't be sure, that the same guy was standing right next to my Civic. I called for my manager, Carl, and
Hey, can you come here for a minute?
he came and I pointed outside to my car. He looked out and said, "What? There's nothing out there." I shrugged and he said to wait for him and he'd walk me to my car. We closed up, and my coworker Steph, Carl, and I all walked to our cars together. There was nothing wrong with my Civic, so I just said goodnight and got in and drove home. I'm pretty sure that happened on a Thursday or a Friday, because the next thing that happened for sure happened on a weekend. The guy came back, which was fine at the time. I just figured he liked shopping at the Dollar General, and that was it. But he wandered and wandered around again, and I mentioned it to Steph when she came near me doing something. Again, we brushed it off, but after an hour of him just walking up and down the aisles, Steph went over to him and asked if he needed any help. He just picked something up at random and brought it up to me, and once again I helped him with his purchase. This time, though, he stared at me, and when I handed him his change, he took my whole hand into his and said, "Thank you very much for working here and letting me shop here. You are very beautiful." I'll be blunt. This guy was a very nice-looking guy. I mean, really well-built, and I figured he was around 19 as I never saw him at school. I found out later he was older. He had those silvery kind of eyes. Maybe it's pale blue, but whatever. I was kind of creeped out by him touching me, but I was also flattered by what he said. I smiled, gently pulling my hand away, and told him it was very nice of him to say that, and he was always welcome to shop here. He smiled back at me and then turned and left the store. It was kind of creepy overall, but like I said, and I'm not saying this for all women, so don't get me wrong, it just felt different that he wasn't some scary-looking man. He was normal-looking. That night, I was sitting in my room talking to my friend I'll call Brett. We were going to the movies, but he didn't feel well, and I told him I'd stay on the phone with him and talk. My room is at a corner of my house with 2 windows in the same corner, so one view was the road and the other looked out into the woods behind the house and over the roof of our patio. Our driveway is pretty long as the house is set back from the road, but I remember looking out into the dark and seeing a car just sitting at the edge of our yard. I didn't think anything of it. It could have been anybody, just maybe someone looking at their phone or whatever. Brett said something that made me pay attention, and I got engrossed in the conversation again. He was a guy I'd known for a while as we grew up in the same area, but tonight he asked me who I liked and stuff like that. I was thinking of what to say because I did like him, but it was just awkward saying it. I changed the subject and looked up. The car was gone. "Kelly?" he asked. "Hello?"
Oh, I'm sorry, what?
"Did you not just hear what I said? If you don't want to go steady, I understand. Just tell me."
Oh my god, what? Really?
Look, I get it. We've been friends for...
Yes, Brett, yes. I want to be your girlfriend.
He then broke out into Avril Lavigne teasing me, and that made me laugh. I looked up and stopped. The same car was at the end of the driveway again, just sitting there. I told Brett, and he thought it was just a coincidence. I turned off my bedroom light and sat at my desk looking out at it, and after a few minutes it took off.
Brett, I just turned off the light, and it drove away.
He thought it was weird too, but told me not to worry about it and started talking about what we could do together when he got better. Finally, I said goodnight and was going to get into bed and watch YouTube videos. My mom came up and asked how I was, and I told her I now had a boyfriend, and she asked who, and I told her it was Brett. She smiled. My parents loved Brett. He was a good student and a great athlete, and one time he helped my grandfather with a tire change when he saw him stranded on the side of the road. That made him a hero, and until 2 years ago when my grandfather finally passed, he always asked about him and loved when Brett came around. Anyway, I started watching funny videos, and I was starting to drift off when I heard a noise from outside, and coming from the backyard to be specific. I didn't think anything of it, and then it stopped, so I just went back to my videos. Then I heard a scraping sound, and it made me scared, so I turned off my phone and just sat there in the dark. It was dead silent. My parents were asleep, and my brother was on a date or something. I don't know why, but I suddenly had the urge to get out of bed and get away from the back window. I quietly moved to my bedroom door and sat down behind it, but I could still peek around it and see the windows. There was a faint scrape again, and my blood ran cold. There was a face in the window looking in. It was too dark to see any features, but I saw enough to know it was a person staring into my room. A light came on like a flashlight, and it went all around my room, and before I slid all the way behind the door, I saw a little red light next to the brighter light. It didn't hit me right away, but someone was out on the patio roof taking a video of my room. After a few minutes of me shaking and terrified behind the door, the light went off and I heard that scraping sound again. I sat there for what felt like forever, but then I saw car lights coming up the driveway, and then a louder scrape and a thump. My brother had just gotten home, and I think he scared away who was up on the roof of my patio looking into my room. I got up and ran to my parents and woke them up and told them what had happened. They have always been pretty strict with me, but they've always treated me with respect and never did the typical, "It was just a dream, honey," or "Forget about it, sweetheart, go back to sleep," when I've been upset. My dad got up, grabbed one of his shotguns from its secret spot in his room, and went downstairs. My mom held me, and I was crying at this point. My brother Mike had just come in the door, and we could hear the two of them talking, Mike asking Dad why he was walking around with his shotgun. There was more murmuring, and they both went outside, and I heard the back door slam shut. Mom and I went downstairs to the kitchen to get some hot chocolate to calm down, and both of them came back in.
What did you see?
I asked quickly. Dad shook his head. Nothing, darling. This was a lie. I later found out that an old wooden ladder we had near a storage shed had been propped up against the side of the patio. Mike said he didn't see anything on his way up the driveway either when he came home. Dad told me to go back to bed and that everything was going to be okay. I asked to sleep in Mike's room, and he said that would be fine. He's always been very protective of me. The next day I had chores to do around the house and was outside with Mike clearing up the yard. I looked over my shoulder at one point and swore that same car from last night drove by. I told Mike, but he only got a glimpse of it as it sped away down the road. Later that day, Brett called me to say that he was feeling better, and I told him about everything, and he was sorry he wasn't there to help me. We talked for a while, and then I watched a movie with my parents and went to sleep, and nothing happened. Maybe it was just a one-time robber or something, I don't know. I was trying to justify it and not be scared. I went to work after school a few days later, and it was also just a regular day. I stopped at a local restaurant to get a pizza for my family's dinner after work and was standing in the lobby waiting for it. I got this weird feeling that something was wrong, and I looked up from my phone, and the guy from the store was standing there looking at me. "Hi, you getting a pizza? It's the best around here, you know," he said.
Yeah, it's good.
"My name is David, by the way," he said, walking towards me.
Okay, I hope you enjoy your pizza.
"Oh, I'm not getting anything. I just happened to see you come in here, and I thought I would say hi." What the fuck? Was he following me around everywhere I went?
I don't mean to be rude, but why are you following me around?
Whoa. It's not like that at all. I just think you're pretty, and we knew each other from the Dollar General.
Well, I have a boyfriend, so...
That's okay, he said. Maybe we could just have dinner sometime as friends. I was floored.
We're not friends, David. I don't know you. I'm sure you're great, but I'm gonna go home now.
My number got called, and I got my pizza and walked quickly to my Civic and tore out of there. When I looked in the rearview mirror, I could see he was standing at the door, just looking at me. When I got home, my mom noticed I looked off and asked if everything was okay. I said it was, and later that night called Brett and told him. Mike came into my room, and I asked if he knew who this David guy was, and he shook his head. And Brett had never heard of him either. He was a grade above me at school. Nothing else happened at the store or anywhere else that week. Brett and I went to the movies that weekend, and he dropped me off at my house and said he'd call me later so we could keep talking. You know how it is in the first stages of a relationship. He kissed me, and I melted and was so happy. I went upstairs after telling my parents I was home, and not long after, Brett called me. We talked until like 2 in the morning, me just snuggled up in my blankets in the dark. Then I sat up and screamed. There was a face in my window, and I swear it was David. The dark shape left my view, and my dad came pounding in my room to protect me. I told him what I saw, and he ran downstairs and outside the house. He came in later saying he circled the house like 3 times but didn't see anyone. But he did call the police, and they came out to talk to me. They took a report, but that was it. But it wasn't the end of David, and what came was one of the scariest things that has ever happened to me. Before it got really cold, I wanted to hike out to this pond that was about a mile behind my parents' house through some woods. Brett was going to come with me to take some pictures, as we were both in a photography class at school, but he also played basketball, and the coach had called a weekend practice out of nowhere. He was going to come over for dinner after that. Before you pass judgment, I know I shouldn't have gone out there by myself with all the weird things that were going on, but I was a stupid kid. I admit that, so spare the "you're an idiot" in the comments. I walked through the woods out to the field where the pond was and set up my monopod with my camera, and I was looking for interesting things to take pictures of. And then I got that weird feeling of being watched, and looked around, but no one was there. I went back to my camera, and then I heard it. Kelly. It was David standing behind me with this strange look of anger and excitement on his face. I froze. I was petrified. Absent-mindedly, I fired off a bunch of images on my camera before stammering out,
"What are you doing here? What do you want?"
David stood there for a minute, and then started walking towards me slowly. "You, Kelly. I've been watching you even when you don't know it." I thought quickly for something to say, and all I could come up with was,
"My brother and boyfriend are going to be here any minute, so you should run away."
"Well then," he said, "that only gives me a few minutes to see if the carpet matches the drapes." My stomach dropped. I didn't know what to do but scream, drop my camera, and start running away. He chased me down and tackled me, and I kept screaming, but he just grabbed me and held on to me. I screamed, and he put a hand over my mouth and started groping me, grabbing my breasts, and tried to shove his hand down into my leggings. I was fighting back with everything I had, but he held me there as he kept saying stuff like he'd be the best I'd ever have, and that I just needed to relax and I wouldn't get hurt. I started crying and kept trying to scream, and then suddenly his grip was gone. The impossible happened. I looked up, and Brett was standing there with a big stick in his hand, and he had smashed it against David's forehead as we were right on the ground. I had my eyes shut, so I never saw him coming. My brother Mike was right behind him. He had seen Brett jogging through our yard hoping to catch up with me and mistook him for the creepy David. I could barely breathe and just kept saying,
"Oh my God! Oh my God!"
over and over, and Brett held on to me while Mike put his knee on the back of David's neck as he lay there dazed. Mike then took out his cell phone and called the police and asked them to call my dad and get out there. They did, and everyone came out to us. I fell into my mom's arms crying, and my dad talked to the police as Brett and Mike stood off to the side. David tried talking his way out of it, but the police told him his rights and that he'd better shut up. They found a package of 3 condoms on the ground where he had tackled me, and he denied that they were his. The police took him away and told me they would need to talk to me some more back at the house. Dad grabbed Brett the way he does when he really likes someone. It's kind of this bear hug, half Nelson kind of thing, and I think Brett thought he was going to kill him. My dad's a big guy, and looking back, that makes me smile. Mike grabbed my camera, and I held Brett's and my mom's hands all the way back to the house. I told the police everything, and they took notes of all the stuff I told them since the first store incident. Then I remembered my camera and asked if I could look at it. Sure enough, on it were the pictures I snapped without thinking about it. David could clearly be seen holding the condoms in his hand as he walked towards me. The police wanted the pictures as evidence, so I gave them the memory card. We found out David was 22 and fairly new to the area. He lived with his grandmother and had been in a lot of trouble where he had lived before. For what he did to me, he was charged with attempted rape, assault, battery, and a few other things. Going to the trial was super stressful, and I lost a lot of weight, and I'm now in counseling and on anxiety medication still. I'm also studying something called Krav Maga to protect myself in the future. My brother Mike took it and said it's a good idea. I'm 21 now, and I'm still with Brett. He saved me that day, and no matter what the future holds for us, I will love him forever. He's actually been sitting here next to me as I write this down. I've had to edit "stop playing with my hair" twice now as I actually wrote that out. Wow. I'm glad I can laugh about this in some small way. To wrap this up, always be aware of your surroundings and never take anything weird lightly. Tell everyone everything you can and protect yourself, and just be wary of strange people.
I love you, Brett. And David, you can go to hell.
Something on Vancouver Island. In 2005 on Vancouver Island, we ran into a den or nest about 15 to 20 feet long, constructed of old rotten tree sawdust, cedar branches and wood shavings, moss, dirt compacted on top of torn and chewed up wood chips about a half-foot long. All of the branches and twigs were weaved together over top of a big hole which was dug into the ground. Over the top of the hole, large trees had been dragged and placed over the hole, and this all led up to a huge old-growth fallen tree crossing the trail. The first thing we noticed then was about 15 or 20 trees had all been topped. That is, pushed over, broken off at the height of about 6 feet, and dragged over to make this nest. There was debris everywhere. This was an area where there was no windfall, and these trees had been pushed down, pointing towards one another and facing down the path towards the den. At this time, my husband was already standing on the end of the nest on top of the fallen tree, just taking in the scenery, when all of a sudden, I noticed a black hole deep down near his right leg, and 2 blinking, beady, silvery black eyes that caught the light. I proceeded to walk on the soft part of the nest, when all of a sudden we heard a loud echoing that seemed to be coming from all around us. It sounded like large boulders being thrown down and hitting the trees, or someone with a sledgehammer hitting the trees. There were 3 loud smacks, and then a pause. And then 3 more loud thumps coming from beneath us, with the force of a semi-truck coming into a building. So strong it was actually pushing me up. I was 15 feet away from the main fallen log my husband was standing on. It seemed like there must have been more logs beneath me in the hole that I was standing on. There was another pause, and my husband walked over to where I was standing. We were discussing what was going on when it seemed that the thing heard us talking. It gave us 3 more loud thumps, and I thought it would come up from the ground and pull us in. We talked ourselves into believing it was a bear in order to get our legs moving, and they were frozen in fear. There were no grunts or growls, there was no odor, but there was a feeling of impending doom. We then ran up an embankment thinking it might follow the trail behind us. My husband kept looking back and thought he saw a black thing coming out of the hole. I was expecting it to come from behind when I saw another black object to my left running parallel to us through the woods. I instinctively knew it was heading towards the log we initially crossed over into this territory. I honestly felt that whatever it was trying to intercept us, but we got out of there and phoned the conservation officer, describing it as a bear den. He didn't believe us. He didn't believe bears could build dens that large, never mind on a trail. 3 years later, we were on another hike, and from the beginning of the hike, we heard a sinister and playful cackling call. Down by the falls, we also heard a yelping call. On the way back, I had given the woman I had just met an antihistamine for her bee sting, as she was getting an allergic reaction. She was fine all the way through, and then things started to get strange for everybody. Some of us were hearing noises in the bushes. Others felt terrifying fear as we came to a clearing next to a large gravel pit. In the distance, we saw farmyards and mountains. We stopped for a moment, and then turned left on the trail and continued down. This is where I heard a low growling on the right of me up ahead. The trees were no longer tall, but there were shorter bushes closing in and overgrown on the trail all around us. The trail forked off, and my husband proceeded to turn right towards the growling. He stopped and realized we should have gone straight, so we had to backtrack. The woman all of a sudden started walking quickly ahead of us, leaving her husband behind. And this is when we started to hear a dragging noise to the left of us. It sounded like boulders being dragged across concrete. I knew we were heading in the right direction, some sort of animal or beast, but it was the only way out. The woman started talking irrationally, to herself and out loud. And all of a sudden she stopped, turned around and went barreling back toward us, shouting, "I have to be with my husband!" She grabbed his arm and they started running back to the gravel pit. I asked the other hikers what was going on. They said the couple were heading back to the people. And I said, "What people? We didn't see any people." The other hikers said that they were heading back to the pit, so I felt intense fear for her because she was heading back to the direction of the heavy growling. I quickly went back to them and everybody followed, and I shouted, "There's no people back there!" And they shouted back, "We tried to get in here through the sand pits from the road, but we couldn't make it in. But that's how we planned to get out." It dawned on me that they sounded panicked. I yelled back, "If you couldn't make it in, you're not going to make it out. We've got to follow my husband. He knows the best way back to the cars." All of a sudden, the woman laughed and calmed right down, and she told me she just had a panic attack. And I kept her talking as we went back towards the way out. We then came upon a gigantic tree stump with roots about 5 or 6 feet tall laying on the side, blocking the entire path. It seemed out of place as there were no big trees around. My husband said there were large boulders strategically placed around the stump. As we all climbed through and over it, I got stuck for a second, entangled in the roots. I was too afraid to look to my left, afraid I was going to be attacked by something. I got out and turned around and saw a large gaping hole dug under this tree. I was worried it was another den. I did take a picture of it, and I think that there was something up with that tree. Shortly after that, we came to some big cliffs we needed to descend down from with some ropes heading to the creek. Barreling down the left side of me, 50 feet down, something was leaping through the cliffs and through the trees, smashing and crashing and breaking through. Almost all of us heard it, and I said to my husband, "Something's down there." He said he knew, but we had to keep going. And just then, I saw a black thing flash through the trees, crossing the trail below, meeting up with the thing on the left. Later on, I found out my husband and friend had a sighting to the left of us just before the creature went crashing down the cliff. Marie looked into the eyes, she said, of a light brown creature, and seconds later, her and my husband saw the same creature running on our left. Again, light brown in color, and running upright. They said it was the size of a skinny man. Not that tall, extremely hairy with long fringed hair about 6 inches long on the arms. At that time, it was looking straight ahead. It was taking long, leaping strides and swinging its arms. And when we got down to the bottom of the creek, the rest of the group had taken off on us. The couple was gone, and we thought the others had gone with them. I was the first to get to the creek bed, and as I waited for the others to come down the ropes, I feared I'd be attacked by something. I felt really vulnerable. We all had one last large embankment to climb. And there were tons of huge trees laying everywhere, just smashed, huge, hundreds of years old. We kept wanting to stop to catch our breath, but my husband wouldn't let us. And he was behind us, and he said to me, "If you'd seen what I just saw back there, you'll understand why we need to get out of here now." My friend looked up and said, "I saw it too. We do have to get out of here." We continued climbing up, all the while hearing a deep moaning following us, and it was always getting louder. When we got to the top where it was flat, our friend Len was up there. He said he didn't follow the couple out of the woods, but he knew that we all needed to get out of the woods now. We had about another 15-minute hike out, and all the while we felt stalked and watched. When we got to the road in the car, we still felt like we were being watched from the trees. Listen, some of us are teachers, some of us are nurses. We're all educated people not prone to panic. We're all experienced hikers, and we've all encountered bears and cougars before. I assure you, this was different. He Was in My House. Submitted by Carolyn A. Just found your channel and hoping to share. 3 autumns ago, my husband and son went out to their tree stands to try to get their first deer of the shotgun season, and I was just puttering around the house trying to get an early start on getting the house ready for Thanksgiving. I was hosting that year, and I didn't want to be running around at the last minute. Scott and Teddy left early in the morning, so I did take my time having breakfast and making a list of things I needed at the store. We lived about 35 miles from the nearest Walmart and Target, out in the woods in our dream home that we were able to build after my husband got into a terrible work accident. Scott worked in a power plant, and the company was negligent with a piece of equipment that basically fell apart during an inspection, and something with a flywheel came undone and took my husband's foot off right above his ankle. He was given a huge settlement, and we were able to build our family home. Funnily enough, they brought him back as a consultant, and he makes more now than he did then. Such is life. So my men were out hunting, and I went into town to get some decorations and things for the house. I was in Target for about 45 minutes and got what I wanted and threw everything in the back seat of my Infiniti. Looking back, I wonder why I didn't take my husband's Land Rover, but I think it's because we hadn't seen any snow yet. I made the drive home, pulled into the garage, and got my things and went inside. I texted Scott to see how they were doing, and he said nothing was stirring. We own land with some friends between our houses, so the guys were lucky that they didn't have to drive and could just take our quads out to their stands right from the house. I told them to hang in there, and I'd have chili ready when they got home. That's what I started to make after cleaning the great room and front foyer. I went down to the basement to our freezer to get meat for the chili, and noticed my husband's workshop door was closed, which was odd. His gun safe was in there, and he rarely kept that door shut, unless he was woodworking and he didn't want the noise to bother us. I shrugged it off and went back upstairs to cook. While I was working, I was listening to music and singing along, just enjoying the day, and it was getting around the time that they would be coming back. I went to check on the chili, then stood looking out the window at our yard thinking about the coming month. That's when I got the shock of my life. In the reflection of the window, behind me I saw something moving across the room. I stood there at first thinking it was just my eyes, so I turned around and found it wasn't. There was a man standing in my kitchen on the other side of our island. I screamed and backed into the counter. He didn't say anything. He just stood there holding a pillowcase, staring right at me. I made a move for the dining room, and we have an open floor plan, and thought I could get to our back door. He made a move too, and grabbed me and told me to lie down on the floor and I wouldn't get hurt. I screamed for him to not hurt me, and he told me to just be quiet and it would be all over quickly. I didn't know what that meant, so I screamed again, and he yelled to shut up, and he wasn't going to hurt me. "Get the fuck on the floor," he yelled. I did, shaking and crying. He put the pillowcase over my head and tied my hands and legs, and then told me not to move. I heard him go away upstairs, and then I heard him rummaging around up there. I was crying and praying for my husband and son to get home, and hoping they would get there soon. I heard my phone buzz and thought desperately that it was one of them trying to text me. It felt like hours, and the man came back down and asked where my keys were. I was blubbering at this point, and he leaned down right next to me and said, "Where are the fucking keys?" I think I just stammered, out on the counter, and he got up and went into the kitchen. Then I heard our garage door open, my car start up, and the outer garage door opening. He drove away, and I started screaming my head off for Scott or anyone to help me. Literally 5 minutes later, I heard the sound of our quads, and soon my guys entering the basement from the downstairs door. I screamed for help again, and I heard Teddy pounding up the stairs yelling out, "Mom? Mom?" He saw me and dropped down, yelling, "Dad! Dad, something's wrong. Call the police." For whatever reason, Scott kept asking what was wrong, but Teddy kept yelling for him to call help. He got me up off the floor, and I just fell into my son's arms, sobbing and shaking. Scott got upstairs and was on his cell with the police, who said they would be out as soon as they could, and asked if the guy was still in the house. Scott said he didn't know, asked me, and I said I think he stole our car. Teddy ran upstairs with his gun and checked everywhere, and Scott looked in the garage to see my car was gone. They both tried to get me to calm down. Easier said than done. I finally got my story out. Teddy ran all around the house, checking the windows and doors, and everything was securely locked and nothing was broken. I finally stopped breathing like a maniac, and the police got there and they asked me what had happened. I retold my story again, going to the store and everything. Another officer came and they said they found my Infiniti in a parking lot back in town. The keys were still in the ignition, but the car was off. They asked if anything was stolen, and I said I didn't know, and they checked the house with Scott shambling around with them. I gave them the best description I could, but if you've never been through something like this, it's hard to get a good description. I knew he was about my height, 5'5", and he was heavy-set and had a mustache. That was all I remembered, and I'm sure it didn't help. The police said they wanted my car to go through it for a better search, and I said I didn't care how long they kept it. I was now being the mother to a very worked-up son who wanted to go hunt this guy down, and my husband who was trying to console both of us. They did search the car and found the guy's prints all over it, and more importantly, prints all over the inside of the trunk, plus a ratty winter hat that wasn't mine. The detectives came out to tell us what they had found and asked if I was sure I'd locked my car when I was at the store. I told them I thought I had, but I couldn't be sure. One detective nodded and said, "Well, this is just a guess at this point. It looks like some guy got into your car, dropped the back seat down, and then crawled into your trunk. When you got home, he sneaked around while you were doing what you were telling us you were doing, and then he made his move to rob you. I figure he waited till he realized you were the only one at home." I was floored, and my husband said he was selling my G37 that day and getting me a Land Rover, or something without a trunk on it from now on. The guy was a bad thief on top of it all. He only got away with a bunch of my costume jewelry that I kept on my dresser. He didn't even go into our walk-in closet where I kept all my valuable stuff and my husband's watch collection. He did get my son's Xbox and a guitar, but outside of that, that was it. He hasn't been caught yet. I did sell my G37. We put in a new security system that triggers the garage door and the basement door no matter what time of day, and it just bleeps to let us know. And I am still so scared I don't go shopping alone at all. I know this is a weird story, and I've never heard anyone else share something like it, and I know I didn't get hurt, but I still talk to a doctor and freak out at the littlest sounds in the house when no one else is around. Thanks a lot, thief. You didn't get many valuables, but you stole my peace of mind and feeling of safety in my own home. I hope they catch you sometime soon, and you pay for what you took from me. Hunted in the Night. Submitted by Jackson Hole 99. In 1996, my girlfriend and I wanted to take off from our summer jobs and walk part of the Appalachian Trail. We had been hiking together since we met in college, and she was a lot like me and didn't care about living on the trail and not always being able to jump in a shower. Some people think that's gross, but really it isn't. We did bathe with biodegradable soap, but only when we got off the trail every 4 or 5 days and hit up a motel and a restaurant before replenishing our supplies. I know, a lot of folks can't handle that, but we had no problem with it. This trip was a 3-week that took us through North Carolina and part of Tennessee. All told, it was about 170 miles that we covered on this leg. We flew down and stayed with some friends for a day, and they drove us out to the trail. The plan was to get close to the Virginia border to a little town, and then we would figure out how to get back home to King of Prussia in Pennsylvania where we lived. We were very free-spirited back then, and we kind of just let life take us where it wanted us to go. On the trail, we met a lot of really great people like everyone always does. We had tents, but sometimes shared shelters with other hikers. The weather was great, and we were having a blast, making about 10 miles a day or thereabouts. Heather and I had a solid routine down pat, and we knew exactly when the other person needed to get off the trail for running water and a soft bed. It was on this trip that she asked me to marry her. I remember telling her I was the guy and I was supposed to ask that, and we laughed, but I told her we should do it. Sadly, she passed away 9 years later due to some health issues that sprang up. This story is the most intense thing I've ever been through with anyone, and it will forever be etched in my mind. We were one day out from our destination and thinking about a meal that didn't involve noodles and other freeze-dried stuff. We were going to hit a logging road that the trail crossed about 4 miles away and follow that into a little town that had accommodations, restaurants, stores, motels, and a laundromat. We could have made it that day, but if you're an outdoors person, you know the feeling of wanting to savor that last day out in the woods. That last afternoon, we met 2 young guys on the trail that hiked with us for a bit, and then hung out with us at the shelter we were planning on staying the night at. I didn't think it odd at the time, but looking back on it, I should have seen the red flags right away. They only had light rucksacks and were wearing sneakers. They certainly weren't doing any serious hiking. I also remember one of them making glances at Heather a lot, but she was beautiful, and I can't blame anyone who stared at her. Still, I think I was just tired and ready to get off the trail and not taking everything in. As the lights started to fade and we had got some water from a spring, Heather and I made our supper and were ready to just crash before the last stage of our trip the next morning. I hope I don't sound like a creep, and I'm happily married to my wonderful wife, but that last night on the trail with her in my arms before we fell asleep is the way I'll always remember her. We were both in sleeping bags, but I had my arms out of mine and was just holding her. I woke up sometime in the night by the sounds of someone or something walking through the forest. Definitely not on the trail. I immediately thought it was just a critter, but then felt the urge to take a leak and got up and went out away from the shelter. I had just finished my piss when I looked up behind the shelter, and off in the distance, maybe a quarter of a mile away, I saw 2 lights. Flashlights coming down the gentle slope of the hill. This was not right at all, and I got nervous real quick. People don't bushwhack much on the Appalachian Trail, and they certainly don't do it through the woods at night. I'm just telling you, they don't do it. I quickly went back to the shelter and woke up Heather and told her we needed to get out of there. Something was up. She could tell how nervous I was, and she didn't say a word, and we quickly gathered up our gear, put on our packs, and carried our sleeping bags as I told her we had to hurry. I did leave behind my Whisperlight stove and a bottle of fuel. I do remember that. We hustled away from the shelter and looked back to see the lights getting closer than they were before, and Heather just whispered, "Oh my God, you're right." We crept down the trail in the direction we needed to go and pulled off to properly put our bags in our packs. We heard voices off in the distance, and I swear I could see the lights bobbing up to the shelter. I said we need to get moving right now, even though it was dark. I had a really bad feeling. Before we got going again, I did take out my Beretta and put it in my side pants pocket. A lot of people will tell you it's bad and sometimes illegal to carry a firearm on the trail, but while I was sort of granola, I was also not stupid. It stayed in my pack most of the time, except for at night, but now I wanted it at the ready. The voices from behind were now yelling and calling out things we couldn't understand, but again, I knew it wasn't good. It was also hard navigating the trail in the dark despite there being a full moon. That didn't really filter through the trees too much, though. We kept on, not saying a word, and I knew Heather was as scared as I was, and we just needed to get to that logging road and we could pick up the pace to the main highway and into town. After what I figured was about 3 miles down the trail, we stopped to catch our breath and drink some water. The trail had started to slowly rise, and I was sure we were getting close to the road as my shitty map did show a change in terrain. If you've ever hiked the AT, you'll know that the maps can be terribly deceiving and sometimes totally fucking useless. Thank God that wasn't the case this time. We got back moving, and suddenly I got a strange feeling and stopped. I put my arm out to stop Heather and peered up the trail. There was a break in the trees, and I could make out the moonlight and clear sky and noticed something strange. There was a shape on the edge of the trail right near that clearing, and suddenly it rose up, and I could see the silhouette of a person standing there. I quietly told my girlfriend to slowly get off the trail to our left, and that we were going into the woods. She did, and I followed her, trying to be as quiet as I could, and we moved about 50 feet into the trees. A few minutes later, we saw the beam of another flashlight coming down the trail from the direction we were going. I think I held my breath for like 3 minutes, that's what it felt like. This figure walked by our hiding spot and down the trail. I told Heather to stay right with me, and we crept back to the trail, and when we got to it, I saw the light disappear around the bend and then vanish into the darkness. I knew for sure we were being hunted. We got back on the trail and double-timed it up the small ridge. It dropped back down, and after about 15 minutes, we did come to that logging road. There was a little creek that ran beside it, and some of it spilled across the road between the mouths of the trail. I started for the other side, and Heather asked what the fuck I was doing, and I told her, "Shut up and just follow me." We walked through the damp parts of the road, leaving boot prints in the direction of the trail, and then we immediately got off of it and followed the edge of the road closely, heading back to the main road. We got about 200 yards down and then popped back out onto the road. Off in the distance, we heard the yelling again, and I stopped and looked back down the road. We could see 3 little lights come out onto it and stop right where we had walked in the mud. There was more yelling, and the lights went across and back up into the trail, and we didn't hesitate to turn and keep moving really fast. It took another half hour to get to the main road, and then it was about 2 more miles into town. We kept going, and at one time a truck came by us, and for one terrifying minute, I thought for sure it was whoever was out there looking for us. It wasn't, thank God again, it just drove on. We got into town, and there was an AmeriCorps open, and we got a room. It was now about 4 in the morning, and I realized I was still shaking. Heather was upset too. I collapsed on the bed while she showered, and then I did too, and we got under the sheets and talked about what had happened before finally falling asleep. The next day we had to do laundry, and I could not stop looking over my shoulder and eyeing up everyone who came into the laundromat. I saw a sign on a bulletin board for a guy who gave people rides for reasonable prices, and I went to a payphone and asked him how much it would be to take us to Damascus, Virginia. He said $50. and I told him to pick us up at the hotel the next morning, and after some barbecue and sleep, we were on our way to get a rental car to drive home. Can I say for certain what those people were up to? No, but it was odd that they came to our shelter in the middle of the night, and that there was someone else on the trail walking around that late. I'm convinced that they had bad intentions for us, and that we were lucky to get out of there when we did. My second wife and I still hike, but they're just day trips with our kids. I'm sure I'll get back out there, but after over 20 years, that night has stayed with me, and deep down I think I want that to be my last long trip and to let it rest with Heather. I think that's only fitting.